Hi, and welcome to Module 4. In this module, we're going to take a look at the characteristics of students on the autism spectrum. This is an important thing for us to really understand because there's been a pretty significant growth in students who qualify for autism, who've been diagnosed with autism by their physician. And so this is something you're going to see a lot in your classrooms, whether you're working in elementary school, middle school, high school, residential setting. And it really kind of begins a series of us looking at characteristics that are kind of closely associated with each other. So we're going to look at autism in this module, and then in the next couple modules we're going to look at emotional behavior disorders. We're going to look at students with ADHD. And so generally the conversations that we're going to be having over the course of the next few weeks is going to be related to characteristics of behavior and social relationships. So that's kind of why we have skipped ahead some chapters for now. We're going to go back and really look at these closely. So kind of what we're going to do today is basically lay out what is autism, how are students identified as being autistic, and then look at some of the characteristics. We're going to look at some tips and tricks that impact the classroom. We're going to look specifically at behavior and language and how that affects students on the autism spectrum, and then talk a little bit about IEP development, primarily focusing on the idea of functional behavior assessments to determine what's causing a problem behavior, and then looking at some key folks within the IEP process that can be helpful to you. One of the things that I'm excited about for next week is talking about a book I have been reading recently called How Children Succeed, and it's written by Paul Tough, and it talks about developing grit, curiosity, and hidden powers of character. And you might think, how does this apply to autism or students with emotional behavior disorders, which is what we're going to be looking at next? Well, what this book lays out is kind of what traumatic incidences, experiences do to our students. What does it do to their brains? What does it do to their bodies? And the reason that I bring this up is because a lot of our students, especially on emotional behavior disorders, but also students on the autism spectrum, can have traumatic things happening to them in their life. A lot of you in this course work in alternative placement programs, residential programs, juvenile detention programs. You're dealing with students on a daily basis that have been through a lot of trauma in their life. And so this book kind of lays out some things that we can do to help students process that and deal with some of the repercussions that affect how we learn from going through those situations. So I'll be excited to talk more about this book specifically in the next module. But if you want some information on it, shoot me an email. I can send you the ordering information for it. But for today, we want to get back to really looking at what autism is. And autism is defined in the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition. Okay, that's a long title. But it's developed by the American Psychiatric Association, and most students that you will come in contact with that are identified as autistic were initially identified by a physician, typically during their early childhood years. Usually when they reach 2, 3, 4, parents start to notice differences. They start to become involved in the infant-toddler process, and testing is suggested for them. And this is done typically by a physician because they're looking to see if these students have very specific criteria that must be present to be identified autistic or identified as having a pervasive developmental disorder. And those are social communication impairments and restrictive repetitive behaviors. You'll notice in the text it talks a little bit about Asperger's, and that Asperger's has been removed from the DSM-5, so that is not a diagnosis that students are currently given. They fall underneath that all-encompassing umbrella of autistic. The text also gives you some data just on how frequently we're seeing students identified with autism. Typically it's boys that we're seeing identified. 7.1% of all students age 3 to 21 are identified with autism. And so kind of gives you some reasons for the drastic increase in numbers that we've seen, which I'll kind of makes sense as you look at that. So if you're more interested in that, look at that in the text. But what we really want to look at today are some of the characteristics related to autism. And so when we dig into this first one, looking at a social communication impairment, there are 3 criteria that must be present for students to be identified as autistic. The first is social emotional reciprocity. This is important because this really talks about how students communicate with each other. How do they take turns? How do they have shared interests? Taking initiative within social situations. So, putting themselves out there, initiating a conversation, asking someone to play, and sharing. All of those things play into this, okay? The next one's nonverbal communication. So physicians really look at and assess how these children interpret body language, how they interpret facial expression, gestures. Are they making eye contact, or do they want to avoid eye contact? That's probably something you've seen with your students on the autism spectrum. And then kind of how does their language and their nonverbal behaviors line up? Is it consistent? Is it making sense? All of those things are examined and assessed. And then when we look at how students maintain relationships, here we're really looking at, are students able to adapt to the context of where a relationship is, whether it's a relationship at school, a relationship in the home, a relationship on the playground? How does that at the park? Are they able to adapt to those different expectations? Are they able to make friends? That's really important. Do they have kind of a lack of interest and initiative in approaching peers? This is something that they also look at. One of the things I will say that Josie kind of falls into some of these characteristics. I'll just give you some examples so you kind of have some examples of what this looks like. So Josie wants to have a friend really badly. She does. She wants to have a friend. It's important to her that she has friends. But she really has trouble with that give and take of play with friends. And so if we have a play date and a friend comes over, it isn't where she maybe asks them what do they want to do, and then they go do that for a little bit, and there's a lot of give and take on what they're doing. Maybe they play a game. There's some turn taking. It's more of she wants them to just follow her around and be interested in what she's interested in. Like, she loves Pinkalicious, so for the next hour she wants you to sit down and look at her 15 different Pinkalicious books. Well, the friends that come over and play don't always want to do that. They see other toys she has. They may want to play with Legos, and she's real resistant to changing and to that give and take and sharing. And so that's a real challenge for her. She also doesn't approach peers very well and ask them to play. She's very reserved. And on the playground, she'd much rather just sit by herself. She does not want to have that interaction with peers. And so it all kind of has to be kind of on her level. She has to be in charge. You have to do what she wants to do. So it makes it a challenge for her to have a friend. I have to say now, as a parent, really her only friend is her brother. And that's because they're so close in age and they've grown up together and he gets her. But she doesn't yet have a really good friend. That's a goal that we have for her, is to have a friend. So that just kind of gives you an idea of maybe what some of those would look like for a student. Something else that I kind of want to point out to you, I teach a course called SPED 821. It's for our teachers working on their autism certificate, and we have a course on building social relationships. And one of the things we do is talk about evaluating social skills. This is a checklist that we use in the class. And I like this checklist because it really details for us all the different skills that build on each other to help a student be successful at social skills. Because sometimes I think we make assumptions that these things are easy, that it's easy to play with another kid. It's easy to take turns and do that group activity. That it's easy to go out on the playground and run and play when it's unstructured. Those are actually really hard skills, especially for our students on the autism spectrum, to learn. And what we have found is they have to have very specific instruction on how to do those. So, for example, on this one's talking about social play and really looking at what are the steps that have to occur. And there's 9 of them here, which is amazing, to go from playing parallel with their own set of toys. So, for example, Bobby's here playing with his Legos and Joey's here playing with his cars. they're doing it side by side, but there's no interaction, okay? To getting down to that cooperative play in an unstructured group, so like going out on the playground and playing kickball and getting involved in a kickball game, or where the teacher is not providing structure to how that's happening, okay? So if you think about the expectations we have for students on the playground, or we have for them interacting maybe in a group assignment at the high school level, and all the steps that take place that they need to be able to successfully do independently, you can see how they would have some struggles, especially if we haven't specifically taught how to do that. For example, turn taking in a group game with predictable turns, okay? What about if we have unpredictable turns? And do they know how to do that turn taking in a group setting? Cooperative play in structured groups. Just lots of different steps that have to take place before they can do that unstructured cooperative play. The other thing it looks at is attending and being able to really focus and participate. And so it kind of walks through the different kinds of activities and different levels from easy to hard. So one of the first things we can work on is attending during meals. So if you have snack time or lunchtime, all the way down to attending during discussion activities. So if you think of about a middle school student on the autism spectrum, they're struggling to participate in discussion activities in the general ed classroom, and you're just not sure why. You can kind of look back at this and think, okay, are they able to attend successfully at recess? That's one of the steps before that. Are they able to attend during listening activities? So if we're doing a story, can they successfully attend? So it kind of gives you some ideas too of some skills you can work on and teach. For the next, we're going to take a short break here, and then we're going to take a look at those repetitive and restricted behaviors.